He laughed at my lawyer, actually laughed, right there in the hallway outside Department 42, like the whole thing was already over, and the only reason we were all still standing there in our good shoes and courthouse clothes was because the universe hadn't caught up to his version of the story yet. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel Mercer, leaned back against the pale stone wall of the King County Courthouse in Seattle. Expensive navy suit, silver tie, watch, glinting under the fluorescent lights, and looked straight at my attorney as if she were a punchline. Then he looked at me and smiled with that same polished cruelty I had spent 11 years trying not to name out loud. "You really brought her?" he said. He didn't say attorney, he said her, as if competence had a gender, and he had already priced it lower. I remember the way my lawyer, Andrea Bell, adjusted the folder in her hand before answering. No dramatic glare, no snapped comeback, just a calm, practical movement. She was in her 50s, compact, immaculate, with dark curls pinned back and the kind of stillness that made loud people reveal too much. I had hired her 3 weeks earlier after Daniel's first settlement offer arrived with a non-negotiable deadline, a threat about legal fees, and a clause transferring temporary occupancy of the house to him, while I continued paying half the mortgage, on a house he had already been trying to refinance behind my back. That was the legal anchor, the hard metal truth under all the emotion, the thing that turned a failing marriage into a financial ambush. Because 6 days before the hearing, my bank called to verify a debt-to-income update tied to an application I had never approved. Same property address, same loan number, same house in Laurelhurst with the cedar siding, the 2 Japanese maples in front, and the kitchen window over the sink where I used to stand before dawn, packing lunches and checking work emails. Only this time my name had been entered as a non-occupant spouse. A technical phrase that made my stomach drop so fast I had to sit down on the laundry room floor. Daniel had not just planned to leave me, he had planned to reposition me. He wanted control of the house, the equity, the narrative, and eventually the cash that came with both. Andrea knew all of that before she ever stepped into the courthouse. She knew about the refinance inquiry. She knew about the draft occupancy clause. She knew Daniel had moved $15,000 from our joint brokerage account into an LLC I'd never heard of, called Mercer Strategic Holdings. She knew he'd told his attorney I was emotionally volatile and financially uninformed, which would have been funny if it weren't sitting in a sworn declaration filed with the court. So when he laughed, she just looked at him and said, "Mr. Mercer, confidence is not evidence." By then it belonged to a man who had heard his own name spoken a little too many times beside words like disclosure, fiduciary duty, concealment, forensic review. And by then, Andrea had only just started. The truth is, Daniel had always been most dangerous when he was relaxed. Anger I could prepare for. Anger had volume. It threw off heat. It slammed doors and sent texts too quickly and left evidence behind. But his easy moods, his charming moods, the ones where he smiled and made coffee and touched the small of my back in public, those were the ones that meant he was moving pieces somewhere I couldn't see. What he meant was I made his life easier to scale. In the beginning, he admired my caution. Later, he called it small-minded. Then eventually, he turned it into a character flaw I was supposed to apologize for. That was Daniel's pattern. First, he praised equality. Then he used it. Then he punished me with it. We had one daughter, Emma, 10 years old, serious brown eyes, obsessed with sea otters, too perceptive for her own good. By the time Daniel moved into the guest room, She had already learned to scan rooms the way children do when love turns conditional in a house. Then he opened a P.O. box. Then he changed the password on the family office cloud folder. Then a woman from his office named Brielle started calling after 9 p.m. and hanging up when I answered. I remember looking at him across the kitchen island and realizing, with a clarity so cold it felt medicinal, that he wasn't trying to persuade me. After that, things accelerated. He suggested selling the house to reduce stress. And every time I resisted, he shifted the frame. I was difficult, reactive, suspicious. The problem with women like me, he once said over wine at a restaurant where the candles cost more than our first apartment rent, was that we got emotional precisely when sophistication was required. The actual separation began on a Tuesday in February when he emailed me from upstairs. He said he believed a structured transition would be healthiest for everyone. He attached a spreadsheet with proposed expenses, parenting blocks, and a note about preserving assets through efficient leadership. That phrase sat in my chest like glass. Efficient leadership. As if our marriage had been a regional branch office, underperforming against forecast. Then I called my older sister, Nina, who lived in Tacoma and had disliked Daniel since our engagement party, because in her words, he looked at people the way some women look at handbags, assessing quality against personal use. Nina arrived 40 minutes later with takeout noodles, a legal pad, and the kind of fury that makes you feel less alone. "Before you cry," she said, taking off her coat, "open every account, download everything, today." For the next 72 hours, while Daniel pretended civility and slept behind a locked guest room door, Nina helped me gather what I could. Mortgage statements, county tax records, retirement balances, pay stubs, brokerage summaries, credit card PDFs. We found repeated transfers labeled MSH Consulting. We found 2 business credit cards I had never seen. We found a line item for commercial storage in Sodo. We found an insurance policy mailing address that matched the P.O. box. And then we found the property alert. King County had an optional title notification service. Nina signed me up in 6 minutes. 2 days later, I got an email showing a document had been prepared, but not yet recorded, involving a deed package request and lender title work on our property. Daniel denied everything, said title companies ran preliminary pulls all the time, said I was catastrophizing, said my sister was poisoning me. Then, as if the timing were accidental, his attorney sent the first settlement proposal, asking me to waive claims to certain advisory entities in exchange for a modest equalization payment and 6 months of gracious access to the house before Daniel assumed primary occupancy. That was the moment I stopped hoping we could end kindly. He expected me to sign documents that would validate steps he had begun before disclosure, before agreement, maybe even before he officially told me the marriage was over. He was counting on my exhaustion, counting on my fear, counting on the social training that tells women to preserve peace, even while peace is being stripped for parts. Instead, I hired Andrea. I found her because a woman in my office, Paula from compliance, heard me crying in a restroom stall and slid a business card under the door without a word. Later, she told me Andrea had handled her sister's divorce after a restaurant group hid revenue through layered entities and tried to starve her out with delay. "She doesn't spook easy," Paula said, "and she reads footnotes." Andrea's office sat on the 14th floor of an old brick building downtown, with views of Elliott Bay and waiting room chairs so plain they felt like a test. She let me speak for maybe 9 minutes before she raised one finger and said, "Start with the house. Always start with the house. I told her about the refinance inquiry, the occupancy clause, the LLC, the document alert. She asked for dates, copies, amounts, not feelings, not because feelings didn't matter, because facts are what feelings can hide behind when they need armor. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "I think your husband is treating temporary orders like an acquisition phase." She gave the smallest shrug. That can be useful. People in acquisition phase often move too early. By the time of our first hearing, Andrea had already subpoenaed preliminary records from the lender associated with the inquiry and drafted a motion compelling broader financial disclosure. She wasn't flamboyant about it. She didn't promise cinematic justice. She just kept building pressure in places Daniel hadn't bothered to look. That first hearing was supposed to be routine. Temporary use of the house, interim support, parenting schedule, nothing final. Daniel walked in like a man attending a ribbon cutting. His attorney, Marcus Vale, was sleek, expensive, and visibly irritated by Andrea's refusal to perform nerves for him. Daniel had the same contained brightness I used to see before his firm holiday parties, when he knew people were about to clap for something with his name on it. Then Andrea mentioned the refinance inquiry, just at the exact moment Marcus was emphasizing Daniel's need for stability in the family residence due to the wife's volatility. Andrea rose and said, "Your Honor, before residence is discussed, we need to address an undisclosed lending event tied to the subject property, initiated without my client's informed consent during the separation window." Marcus asked for clarification. Daniel turned to him too fast. The judge, Commissioner Hale, gray-haired, impatient, hard to read, looked at Daniel over reading glasses and asked the question I had been asking for weeks. "Mr. Mercer, was there or was there not a refinance application pending on the marital residence?" Daniel smiled. Not the open laugh from outside, a tighter version. "There were exploratory discussions, Commissioner. No final transaction. Was your spouse informed? We had many broad conversations about strategy." Andrea's voice came in clean. "That is not responsive." He actually glanced at her then, and I saw it, that flicker men like him get when a woman refuses to accept the reality they're selling wholesale. The commissioner ordered status quo on the property. No occupancy transfer. No encumbrance. No asset movement outside ordinary living expenses. Full preliminary disclosure within 14 days. Joint access restored to shared financial records. Temporary parenting split. Another review hearing in 3 weeks. In the hallway afterward, that was when he laughed at Andrea. "You made a little noise," he told her. "Congratulations." Andrea tucked a loose page into her folder. "And you made a record. Thank you." Daniel's face didn't fall. Men like him don't drop expression in public. They polish it thinner. "This is why your clients overpay," he said. "You confuse process with leverage." Andrea looked at him the way a surgeon might look at a man bragging about WebMD. "No," she said. "Men like you confuse performative control with ownership. We'll see which is more expensive." Then she turned to me and asked whether I had eaten. Because I had been living inside Daniel's weather for so long that ordinary care felt almost indecent. Daniel produced disclosures that were technically polished and materially evasive, pages and pages of accounts with partial statements, redacted business references, mislabeled reimbursements, management fees paid to Mercer Strategic Holdings, an evaluation summary for his advisory partnership that read like it had been composed by someone allergic to specificity. She found duplicate expense categories billed through the LLC in the marital account. She found a consulting agreement executed 7 months earlier between Daniel and a startup founder in San Diego, with compensation routed to an entity not listed in disclosure. She found a home equity preliminary worksheet in the lender packet we eventually obtained through subpoena, including projected cash-out options. He wanted me out fast enough, confused enough, and legally constrained enough that he could refinance, pull equity, and use our biggest asset to stabilize his own off-book positions before the wider financial picture surfaced in litigation. If he secured occupancy first, he could argue operational necessity. If he restructured debt before division, he could muddy tracing. If he painted me as unstable, he could make my objections look emotional rather than forensic. "Are you telling me he was going to use the house to cover something?" I asked. "I'm telling you," she said carefully, "that timing matters, and his timing suggests pressure elsewhere." Emma came downstairs on a Saturday morning, holding Daniel's phone charger. "Dad left this in the kitchen," she said. "Do you want me to put it in the office?" The charger was wrapped around a second phone. Not his main phone. A smaller one, work-issued maybe, or private. But grief makes thieves out of decent women. It teaches your hands to move before your ethics have finished standing up. The screen lit when I touched it. No lock. Just a message preview from someone saved as B. "Need confirmation you can move 120 by month end, or we restructure without you." Below it, another. "Brielle. Also, your wife emailed the school. She's getting organized." I stood in the kitchen while the refrigerator hummed, and my daughter asked from the hall whether pancakes were still happening, and the blood in my body seemed to recede from the surface all at once. I didn't open the thread. I didn't forward anything. I just took 2 photos with my own phone and put the device back exactly where it had been. When Daniel came home, I watched him cross the living room, checking surfaces with his eyes before he even set down his keys. 2 days later, Andrea had a motion drafted for expedited forensic accounting and supplemental discovery related to undisclosed business obligations. She didn't use the photos directly. She didn't need to. They guided where she pushed. Daniel responded the way he always did when pressure got close to bone. He escalated socially. He called my mother in Arizona and told her I was having a hard time coping. He emailed Emma's teacher suggesting school communications include him because I was disorganized lately. He told mutual friends the divorce was sad but amicable, and that he was trying to be generous despite my attorney's combative style. He started sending me texts that read like exhibits written in advance. "Hope we can keep this calm for Emma. I'm concerned about the tone your sister is bringing around the house. Please remember judges care about reasonableness." Instead, under Andrea's instruction, I answered almost nothing. Logistics only, pickup times, medication notes, school forms. At the second hearing, his attorney argued Andrea was conducting a fishing expedition. Andrea countered with account transfers, disclosure gaps, and lender communications. Commissioner Hale expanded the document order and appointed a neutral forensic accountant for preliminary review at Daniel's expense, subject to reallocation later. That was the first time I saw real anger pass through Daniel's face in court. Afterward, in the garage, he caught up with me before Andrea returned from the clerk's window. "You need to get control of her," he said. Rain tapped somewhere deep in the concrete levels. Cars hissed at the entrance ramp. I could smell damp cement and gasoline and his cologne, cedar and vetiver, the same one he'd worn on our 10th anniversary dinner when he spent most of the meal answering texts under the table. "That's your problem," I said quietly. "You still think I work for you." Then he smiled again. "You have no idea how expensive this is about to get." I stood there with my keys in my hand and understood that the threat was not merely legal. It was personal branding, financial exhaustion, attrition. He believed endurance belonged to the higher earner by default. He believed the person who could spend more could define reality longer. So I did the least glamorous, most important thing of my adult life. I made a war budget. Nina helped. Andrea approved. I cut everything not tied to shelter, Emma, work, or the case. Streaming services, boutique groceries, new clothes, weekend takeout. I sold a designer bag Daniel had bought me after a bonus year he later used to remind me how much I had benefited from his ambition. I moved part of my inheritance into a separate litigation reserve. I told my manager at work what was happening and accepted a less visible but steadier project load so I could keep income predictable and leave when school emergencies happened. He noticed because control-oriented people track changes in dependency the way investors track market sentiment. When I stopped asking him for transfer timing, when I stopped reacting to provocative texts, when I replaced panic with systems, he lost one of his oldest advantages. Then Brielle made her mistake. It happened at a charity gala at the Seattle Art Museum, one of those polished downtown evenings Daniel used to love, because rich people feel most honest around sculpture they don't understand. I was there because my company had sponsored an installation. Daniel was there because his firm sponsored everything visible. We were both expected. Andrea had actually encouraged me to go. I wore black, nothing dramatic, hair up, minimal jewelry. I did not arrive with a date or a performance, just a drink ticket, a polite smile, and my spine. Daniel saw me from across the atrium, and that same smooth public face slid into place. He came over with Brielle beside him in a blue dress like poured glass. She was younger than I'd first guessed, maybe 30, beautiful in the sharpened, professional way that can make every room seem like an audition stage. "Lena," Daniel said, kissing the air near my cheek. "You look well. Brielle, you remember my wife?" Brielle smiled too brightly. "Of course." Then, because vanity ruins more conspiracies than conscience, she added, "I'm glad the March bridge financing worked out. Daniel was a wreck." I watched Daniel's face, and in that fraction of a second, before anyone corrected anything, I knew two things. He recovered almost beautifully, laughed softly, touched her elbow. "She means a client matter." March bridge financing. Bridge financing meant interim capital, stopgap money, liquidity under strain. I stayed another 19 minutes at the gala, spoke to 2 colleagues, made one bathroom visit where I wrote the phrase in my notes app 3 times, and left before Daniel could decide whether I was a threat or an audience. Andrea filed supplemental requests the next morning, targeting short-term lending, private notes, pledged collateral, and communications related to Mercer strategic holdings. Daniel objected, delayed, narrowed, styled everything as irrelevant harassment. Then the forensic accountant, Paul Richter, issued his first preliminary memo. Paul found inconsistent treatment of advisory compensation, undisclosed liabilities connected to Mercer strategic holdings, intercompany transfers lacking clear business purpose, personal legal expenses paid from business reserves, and one line that made Andrea sit up straighter than I had yet seen. Evidence suggests marital residence may have been contemplated as potential collateral support in connection with short-term liquidity arrangements linked to subject spouses' affiliated entities. Written by someone with credentials Daniel could not dismiss as my hysteria. Andrea looked at me across her desk. "He's under pressure," she said. She tapped the memo. "Enough to touch the house before division. That means enough. Because once you understand the architecture of a betrayal, you stop wandering its hallways like a ghost. You begin finding switches. The major twist in the case surfaced at 70% of the way through our misery, almost to the day, in the ugliest, most ordinary way possible, through a corrected exhibit nobody expected to matter. Marcus Vale's office produced a tranche of supplemental documents late on a Thursday evening, clearly hoping volume would do what truth no longer could. Hundreds of pages, loan discussions, partnership summaries, partial emails. Buried inside them was a mislabeled PDF attachment to a board consent packet from Mercer Strategic Holdings. Andrea almost missed it because the file name read insurance_review_final. It was a draft indemnity agreement, and attached behind it, because someone in Daniel's circle had gotten lazy or tired or both, was a personal guarantee rider naming Daniel individually in connection with a failed capital commitment for a private placement that had gone sideways the previous fall. Reference to available equity strategy once domestic occupancy is secured. Available equity strategy once domestic occupancy is secured. As if my daughter's bedroom and my paycheck and the sink where I rinse strawberries before school were just variables in a restructuring model. Andrea did not raise her voice. That was not her style. She became quieter when she was furious. "He turned your continued presence in the home into a barrier to curing a private guarantee exposure," she said, "and he failed to disclose the guarantee. He needed access to it to survive a problem he had created elsewhere, and he had planned to use the court and my trust, and possibly my exhaustion as the tools to get there." Andrea filed a motion for sanctions, exclusive temporary occupancy to me, and a freeze on any business distributions to Daniel pending fuller review. She attached the guarantee rider, the indemnity draft, excerpts from the forensic memo, and the earlier lender materials. Because Daniel only respected pain when it invoiced him. The hearing on that motion took place on a Wednesday so bright it made downtown Seattle look scrubbed clean. I wore cream. Andrea wore charcoal. Daniel wore confidence so brittle I could hear it every time he shuffled papers. Marcus tried to minimize the guarantee as a contingent side matter. Andrea walked the commissioner through dates, sequence, omission, motive. She did not dramatize. She assembled. At one point, Commissioner Hale leaned toward Daniel and asked, "Did you or did you not anticipate using equity from the marital residence to address this personal exposure?" Daniel started to answer in one of his polished fog banks. Strategic planning. Multiple contingencies. No final act. The commissioner cut him off. "That's not an answer." And then something small but unforgettable happened. Daniel laughed. Because contempt was the oldest bridge in his body, he crossed it without thinking. He laughed at the question, at the room, at the process, maybe even at Andrea again, though by then the sound landed differently. Enough to let everyone know the sound had reached the bench exactly as it deserved to. When the ruling came, it came in layers. Exclusive temporary occupancy of the marital home, to me, for the duration of proceedings unless further ordered. No refinance, transfer, pledge, or encumbrance of the property. Expanded forensic review. Immediate supplemental disclosure of all guarantees, affiliated debts, and compensation streams. Temporary restriction on Daniel's discretionary business draws above a set monthly amount absent notice. And $25,000 in interim attorney fees payable by Daniel within 10 days due to disparity, non-disclosure concerns, and conduct increasing litigation expense. I just sat there and felt the strange, quiet sensation of a room returning my weight to me. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain of the exchange rate. That should have been the power reversal, but life rarely obeys neat dramatic timing. The order changed leverage. It did not change behavior. Daniel retaliated the way men like him do when stripped of easy access to money and myth. He started showing up early for Emma's soccer games with orange slices and patient smiles. He told other parents co-parenting was a learning process. He sent me emails about finding peace. He asked whether we should all have dinner for Emma's sake, and copied a therapist he had never before wanted involved. Every gesture was optics, and optics can be exhausting because they force you to look irrational for refusing what, on paper, resembles kindness. Meanwhile, the forensic review kept widening. Daniel's firm placed him on administrative leave, pending internal compliance questions. Brielle vanished from his social orbit. Mercer Strategic Holdings turned out to have little genuine operational substance beyond routing compensation, debt service, and image management through cleaner channels. There were no secret millions waiting in sunlight. That was almost the saddest part. He had risked everything, not because he was masterfully building a hidden empire, but because he could not tolerate the appearance of decline. Once his leave became known, settlement talks changed. Marcus was no longer gliding. He was sweating through collars. Their next proposal looked nothing like the first. Equal house proceeds on sale or buyout, based on neutral appraisal. Recognition of the undisclosed guarantee as Daniel's separate post-separation misconduct exposure subject to argument. Restoration payment on diverted funds. Full release to me of my inherited accounts. A parenting schedule more balanced and less manipulative. He still asked for confidentiality, of course. Men who humiliate publicly always rediscover privacy when the file turns. I thought of Emma upstairs doing math homework with her socks half on. I thought of another year of subpoenas. Another year of school drop-offs under this weather. Another year of hearing Daniel's name in conference rooms and courthouse halls. Andrea's answer was immediate. Finished looks like your daughter sleeping in one home without legal static in the walls. Finished looks like sufficient money, documented truth, and no future hooks. The appraisal came in higher than Daniel expected and lower than I had feared. Because of the fee order, the disclosure sanctions pressure, the guarantee exposure, and the diverted funds tracing, Andrea structured an outcome where I kept temporary occupancy through Emma's school year, then refinanced in my own name using a combination of my income, a support equalization mechanism, and a partial offset from Daniel's share after allocation of misconduct-related liabilities. It was complicated. Not glamorous, very adult. The kind of resolution nobody would turn into a prestige TV montage because the triumph lived in spreadsheets and signatures. The final mediation lasted 9 hours in a glass tower conference suite overlooking gray water and ferries moving like patient thoughts. Daniel arrived thinner, less polished around the eyes, still handsome, if you like your beauty lacquered over panic. He avoided small talk. He avoided me. At noon, he tried once more to frame Andrea as the obstacle. This would have been simpler, he said across the table, if counsel had not insisted on litigating every shadow. Andrea didn't look up from her notes. Shadows don't issue guarantees, Mr. Mercer. By 6:30, we had terms. By 7:15, we had signatures. Daniel kept some business interests, subject to whatever wreckage followed. I kept the right to remain in the home through June with Emma, then execute the refinance package we had prearranged. The diverted funds were credited. The guarantee issue was allocated in a way that prevented him from backfeeding consequences into marital division. There was mutual non-disparagement. There was no admission of fraud, because civil settlements often monetize truth rather than naming it cleanly. And there was one clause Andrea insisted on, that I will love her for until I die. Any future attempt by Daniel to seek indemnity or contribution from me for obligations tied to the undisclosed guarantee would trigger fee-shifting presumptions against him. When mediation ended, Daniel asked if he could speak to me privately. We stood by the window while downtown lights began coming on across the water. "You let her turn this into a war," he said. As if I were still a door he should have been able to open with the correct tone. "No," I said. "You turned it into a war when you put a price on removing me from my own life." I walked back to Andrea, signed the last page, and went home. The months after legal victory were not cinematic either. They were work, boxes, school permission slips, lender packets, Emma's winter concert, tax consultations, therapy, repainting the guest room, replacing the locks, learning how to say no without padding it in explanation, learning that relief can feel unfamiliar enough to trigger its own grief. The refinance in my sole name closed on a rainy Monday in June. The title officer slid the final stack toward me in a quiet office that smelled faintly of toner and coffee. I signed slower than necessary, not because I doubted, because I wanted my hand to witness what it was doing. At the end, the officer smiled and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Mercer. Sorry, I mean, Lena Hart," I said, using my maiden name again. "It's okay." Outside, rain purled on the windshield. I sat in my car for a full minute before turning the key. No soundtrack, no tears, just a feeling like a long-held object had finally been set down without breaking. Emma and I celebrated with takeout Thai on the living room floor because the dining table was still half buried under moving boxes. She asked whether this meant nobody could make us leave now. I told her this meant the house was safe. Then she said, "It felt loud before, even when nobody was talking." A week later, I saw Daniel for the first time since mediation at Emma's school art showcase. He looked recovered in the superficial ways that matter to superficial systems. Better suit, better haircut, a new job, I'd heard, at a smaller firm outside the city. He was speaking to another parent when he noticed me. His body changed before his face did. Tiny pause, tiny brace. That part was accidental and perfect. Her niece attended the same school. We had exchanged a few occasional updates since the settlement, enough to become something warmer than attorney and client, and not quite friends, though maybe on the way. When Daniel saw her beside me, something unreadable crossed his face. He came over because men like Daniel always come over. They cannot bear an unresolved stage line. Emma's watercolor harbor scene hung behind us on a corkboard. Blue fairies, gray sky, orange windows and buildings, home rendered as weather and light. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'm glad things are settled." Andrea, glorious woman that she is, took a sip of sparkling water and said nothing. I looked at him and saw, maybe for the first time, the ordinary machinery beneath the performance. Not a villain carved in granite, just a man who had believed he could leverage intimacy the way he leveraged credit, and had discovered both came due with interest. "So am I said. He gave the slightest nod, then moved away. We stood there for a moment among children's paintings and folded paper fish and the smell of cafeteria coffee. Sunlight from the west windows turned the room gold around the edges. Somewhere nearby, Emma was explaining sea otters to a boy who clearly liked her and had no idea yet how lucky he was to be listening. I thought about the hallway outside Department 42, about Daniel's laugh, about how small I had felt when it first cut through the air. And I thought about the difference between that woman and the one standing here now. Not stronger in the way people glamorize, not unbreakable, just harder to rearrange. He had built an entire strategy around the assumption that I would confuse discomfort with defeat, that I would yield to tone, to jargon, to deadlines, to embarrassment, to the old marital habit of letting him define what counted as reasonable. Sometimes, late at night, I still replay the case in fragments, the bank call, the draft clause, Brielle at the gala, the guarantee rider hidden inside the mislabeled PDF, Commissioner Hale's face when Daniel laughed in the courtroom, Andrea asking if I had eaten, Nina spreading account statements across my dining table like evidence of a weather pattern only sisters know how to read. Power usually arrives as documentation, and the decision to stop apologizing for needing it. He laughed at my lawyer because he thought law worked like charm, like status, like marriage had worked for him. He believed whoever sounded most expensive owned the ending. The ending belonged to the person willing to see clearly, pay attention, and keep going after the room changed temperature. And that house, with its cedar siding and stubborn front steps and kitchen window facing the maples, did not become a monument to survival. I hate when people talk that way. It stayed what it had always been meant to be. A place where my daughter leaves half-finished drawings on the counter. A place where bills get paid on time. A place where no one needs permission to breathe. And the memory of a laugh, fading, until it sounds like nothing at all.